Okay, we're in week 8. We're just about halfway through this course. What I want to do today is go over chapter 10, dealing with externalities. I'm going to start out by sharing the screen with you. You should see chapter 10, externalities. Now, the first thing it talks about with externalities is how the government can play a role in either minimizing or eliminating externalities, either positive or negative. If we produce anything, there are both positive and negative externalities. Because somebody's going to be better off and somebody is not. Or society as a whole will be better or they will not. The government can take action. If the markets don't allocate the resources efficiently, the government can get in there and eliminate any barriers or loopholes or whatever. Whether it's trade or just the logistics of moving a product from point A to point B. The government can potentially help improve the market allocation, reducing red tape. Allows the process to go a little quicker. It doesn't mean it's not working as well. It just means it removes a barrier in the process. Anytime you can prevent a bottleneck, the process will get better, the price will go down, etc. So the government can control externalities on that point. Now, if the government wants to stop something, look at cigarettes. The government wanted to stop the American consumers from consuming cigarettes. So they taxed them nearly out of existence. Now, the individuals it hurts worse are those younger individuals that think they want to smoke, and then you have the other individuals that have the habit but can't afford to smoke. So to them, it's a negative externality. But to everyone else, it could be a positive, getting rid of secondhand smoke, reducing the incidence of lung and throat cancer. So there's a lot of things going on. So we're constantly trying to mitigate the negative and accentuate the positives. Now, an externality is, let's say, well, look at Duke Progress Energy. About 5 years ago, I guess, they had issues with it, maybe more than that, with coal ash ponds that were built when they were generating electricity with coal. One of them ruptured and went into the Cape Fear, one of its tributaries. That was a negative externality. And I'm pretty sure that when the plant was in existence, they didn't charge enough for the electricity to pay for the cleanup of the coal ash. So it was unforeseen, but who ends up paying for it? Usually you and I as taxpayers. Now, you say, well, the government fined Duke Energy heavily for not cleaning up those plants. And Duke Power started cleaning up those facilities and eliminating those coal-fired plants altogether. But you and I are still paying because the price of electricity went up. They didn't do it in a vacuum. They looked at the fines and court costs as just part of delivering energy. So regardless of how the government applied it, it's going to come back to us. Because it's somewhat of a necessity. Now, anytime we have an externality and it changes either the supply or demand, it is a market failure. Because the market has established an equilibrium. That equilibrium determines what the sellers are willing to sell and the buyers are willing to pay. Now, with a negative externality, it's the impact on the bystander is adverse. Like I was saying with the collapse or secondhand smoke. So there's negative externalities. We have positive externalities, where the bystander may benefit from whatever you did. So let's say you have the worst looking house and yard in the neighborhood. Everybody else's looks good. By doing that, you have a negative externality. You're affecting the value of their property. If they wanted to sell and somebody looked at their property and it was right beside mine, they probably wouldn't want it. If I cut my grass, trim the hedges, and paint the house and everything else, that's a positive externality. I can't measure it. And I can't walk over to my neighbor and ask them what it's worth. They just say it's nice. But it is a positive externality. So there are both that exist. If you look at fireworks, normally who delivers the fireworks shows are the communities, the cities, the states. And the reason they do so is because you can't control who receives benefit. I could have a stadium, go to Carter Finley Stadium and charge for seats for the greatest fireworks show in the world. Nobody's going to buy my tickets. Because all you have to do is stand over there at the fairgrounds and watch it. So they would be receiving a positive externality without paying for the product. Usually when you see things like that, the government is the one that comes in and fills that void, if it is a necessity. Exhaust from automobiles, barking dogs. And I think they give us an example toward the end of the chapter, dealing with barking dogs. Positive externalities, restored historic buildings, researching the new technologies. Now, let's say that the government eliminates some red tape on the approval process of drugs. We see that going on now with the COVID-19 vaccines. They've eliminated some of the red tape for these businesses to get out there and really push hard to find a vaccine. We have some already going into human trials. So that will be a positive externality, because if they come up with a vaccine, it's going to affect everyone in a positive way. Now, as individuals, we didn't pay. We didn't have to send a $10 check to the federal government to say, force them to go faster and get this thing done. All the government did was say, we're going to get out of your way. We're going to limit some of these obstacles so you can get to the business of testing these products. Now we have individuals. I don't know if anybody in this class or have issues with some of the vaccines, primarily measles. But according to the experts, and economists are calling their sex experts at this time, declining to be vaccinated against contagious diseases such as measles imposes cost on other people, which is a negative externality. All economists agree that that is true. We had nearly eradicated measles. But there are individuals that believe, right or wrong, statistically it's wrong, but in their environment, they believe that the measles vaccines can cause irreparable harm to the children. So when they do that and they don't vaccinate their child, they're starting to allow that potential disease to come back into force. So they could go into classrooms, and if there's another child that hadn't been vaccinated, or an adult that was not vaccinated at an early age, it could be devastating. Welfare economics, to recap. We know that demand curve is defined by you, the customer. And you're telling the businesses or the market per se that at X price you'll buy X number of units, period. The supply curve is the cost of the suppliers. As long as the supplier covers their costs, they're willing to sell their product. So if they make a penny on it per unit, they're going to produce that product. If they've done their accounting properly, with general accounting principles, they can still survive at zero. Now they can hope the price goes up, and they can hope they can get the cost down. That way they can increase their producer surplus and make the customers happy. Now the equilibrium is the happy place. That's where everything is perfect. And it only exists in our dreams because it's constantly moving. But there are limits to its movement. As we can see it here, that's just a snapshot for that, whatever that product is. It's just a snapshot for steel. In the production of steel, there are byproducts that are disposed of. Those are negative externalities or potential negative externalities. Now, if they can produce at a lower cost, that's fine. We would see the supply curve shift to the right with an increased supply. But if there are negative externalities, they're going to go to the left. And even if they don't physically move their supply curve, the actual production level will be determined by that externality. It's going to be covered through fines or taxes or whatever that will offset and move this supply curve to the left. Now, with negative externalities, we're looking at the larger the cost to producers, because that supply curve will shift leftward. But if they don't pay for the externalities, you and I, the consumer, will pay it. Well, if they pay a higher price, a tax or a fine or whatever, we're still going to pay it based on the slope of the demand curve and the supply curve. When we talk negative externalities, we have social costs and social cost curve. The private cost of producers, that's the supply curve, shift left or right, plus the cost of those bystanders affected adversely by the externality. So individuals getting secondhand smoke, they could sue the tobacco industry to recover costs and damage. Social cost curve is above the supply curve. Just like I was mentioning in the previous graph, it will be above the supply curve. Now, I don't like them saying above, because actually what it's doing is it's shifting it, the equilibrium, to the left. But it is above the previous curve. And we can see it here. The external costs are here, and the way we look at those external costs is in units of dollars. So we can see that from this point right here, that would be the actual cost to the consumer. Now, what happens, we move equilibrium to here, from here to here. Now, we have consumers that are going to exit the marketplace because of this cost. The suppliers are going to produce at this level because of the new cost. So if the curve was perfectly, demand curve was perfectly inelastic, and it was a cost of $100 per unit as far as the cost, they would pay it off. So we have to look at the slope of this curve. The negative externalities, the optimum quantity produced, the maximized quantity produced, which increases the welfare, and the smaller market equilibrium quantity. So we saw that on the previous graph. We would see this quantity fall. So it is a market failure. And the suppliers aren't going to supply this amount if this is the cost they're going to receive. The government can correct the market failure by eliminating the externalities to some degree. And also giving incentives. So the government can give a bee subsidy or corn subsidies or whatever to eliminate potential negative externalities. Positive externalities. Education is one of the biggest positive externalities. If we improve our educational system, there'll be a positive externality to the students, to their families, and to their future children or partners or whatever. Education is key to a lot of things that people want to achieve. Doesn't necessarily mean getting a 4-year degree or a PhD. Sometimes it's just physical knowledge. You could be a trainee and apprentice and learn welding or horseshoeing or farming. It's still a positive externality. Now, the externalities is better government, lower crime rates, higher productivity, and wages. If you look at some of the most impoverished areas in North Carolina, look at what's going on in their high schools. And they're into course testing in comparison with all the other, say, Chapel Hill or Wake County. You'll see a big difference. Now, the social value is greater than the private value. So, to some degree, if you get your PhD in tuba, it's going to make you feel real good. Your other neighbors will appreciate it because you're not going to be a bad tuba player, but it is a private type thing. The social value curve is above the demand curve. So that means we're looking at the demand curve. We see it moving in this direction because this will be the change in our benefit or the value of education. And here's the quantity that's going to be made available. So the social value and private value of the externality or the external benefit. As long as the government's seeing it that way and they're increasing Pell Grants, they're increasing the amount of money you can borrow through student loans. As long as that's occurring, those institutions, those private institutions are going to actually raise the cost of education. You can see it is, they're going to add that extra value component into their equation. So this is dealing with the social cost and the supply benefit. Positive externalities is essentially optimal quantity that everybody ends up with. A lot of times this government gets involved there. The government can correct market failure, internalize externality, and provide subsidies. We can see here with negative externalities, the markets produce large quantities of a product, more than what we even want. If we took in the true cost of producing that product. Going back to Duke Progress Energy, if we had known the cost of producing energy with coal, long-term cost of producing with coal, the price of that electricity would have been very high. It could have given us a subsidy so we could acquire it at the higher prices, but it would still be a large supply. And I mean, a higher price, there'd be a larger supply if we didn't include the cost. Positive externalities, markets produce a smaller quantity than is socially desirable. You see in both cases, in the negative externalities, they produce more than what is needed. Positive externalities produce smaller quantity than is socially desirable. And the government can subsidize it to bring that back to equilibrium. If we go back to the supply curve, we see the market. We have the consumer out of the place, but we do have the market that's wanting to produce at this level. They want to produce at those increased prices. We can look at this one. We can see they want to supply it, but the consumer doesn't want it. Because if you come back over here at this new price, it's going to be wound up here. There's going to be a reduction in quantity because nobody's going to want it. Let's get to technology spillover. That was one of the things that we look at with military spending and NASA spending there. NASA was a big motivator in the expanded knowledge of computers and those type systems. We got several products from them, like the microwave. Those were out of those government programs. They were positive externalities. Look at your GPS. That was same thing. Came out of the space program and the military, and then from the military, it went directly to the consumers. The early GPSs, they'd get you within 10 feet if they were real good. Some would get you within 500 feet. Now, we can survey with the GPS systems we have now. They're so accurate. Now, the government can protect the businesses. They can have industrial policies and promote some industries, like we're seeing with the removal of some of the barriers for the drug companies, pharmaceuticals, to get vaccine. We have patent laws to protect our products. That's one of the big issues we're having with China right now, is they have no qualms about reproducing your product. If you come up with a novel idea that's making money, they'll buy one and reverse engineer it, and they'll have it out in the market in probably 2 weeks. Even if you have a patent on it, they don't care. That's a big problem right now. Ask the expert part 2. They get into a little more detail on the vaccines. And they say, considering the cost of restricting free choice and the share of people in the U.S. who choose not to vaccinate their children for measles, the social benefit of mandating measles vaccines for all Americans, except those with compelling medical reasons, would exceed the social cost. 6% disagree. 5% don't know, and 89% agree. The more specific we get to how to resolve this problem, the first one was just blanket. There be a negative externality. Yes. Now they get in more specific, mandating for everyone else and having exceptions for the others. Now it's getting a little shaky ground, and people are backing out of their original positions. Now we can have command and control policies, regulate behavior directly. We can say, you cannot do this. We can go to the energy companies and say, you cannot produce energy with coal, period. That's a command and control policy. We saw that occurring back in 07, 08. There was a just basic statement, we will not produce anything with coal, and the coal industry was heavily impacted by it. And there were a lot of negative externalities, because when the coal miners didn't work, that means the grocery stores didn't sell as many groceries, the home builder didn't build any more homes or repair homes. So there was a lot of negative externalities when you get into the command and control type systems or policies. Now you have market-based policies to provide incentives to the private decision makers will choose to solve the problem on their own. Basically, the way a lot of people perceive it, if there's a problem in the market and the consumers are knowledgeable about it and the suppliers are knowledgeable about it, so all parties know what's going on, they're probably going to come up with a better solution than just a government act. The government on these type policies, market-based, they can correct with taxes like they did with cigarettes, or they could give subsidies to get more, and they could have tradable pollution permits. So they can say all you can produce is X amount of pollution, and you have to buy permits to do anything beyond that. So the government can get into the marketplace as well. Regulations regulate behavior directly, making certain behaviors are required or forbidden. We have laws, we have rules, we have regulations. If you want to know how many regulations the government has or they're proposing, just go to the Federal Register. Every policy or proposed regulation is included in that document. We're talking volumes upon volumes of material. There's a lot of regulation that goes on. In New York City, you can't sit down on the stairwell. Why? Because somebody may trip over you. That's a negative externality. But if nobody's there and you're sitting on it, what harm is it causing? Doesn't matter. It is forbidden. Now, we cannot eradicate pollution. Even if we took everybody on Earth and dug a big hole and put everybody in it, covered them up, we're still going to have to deal with pollution. We won't, but something will. We still have animals. We still have uh, single cell organisms, and we have insects, and we have things, plants, a lot of stuff still going on. The plants take in the carbon dioxide and exhale the O2. That's pollution. They're taking something and changing it and putting it back into the system. The Environmental Protection Agency was very, very overbearing since their creation. They've created a system where they were judge, jury, and executioners. They could establish rules, and you had to comply, whether they were logical or even doable. One of the things that hit the coal plants so hard and eliminate a lot of them was the EPA kept changing the standards, the emission standards. They came out and told the coal companies, you're going to have to meet this standard in 10 years. So all the coal companies found technologies, and they put the technologies in play. It cost them billions of dollars. And as soon as they had that done, the EPA came out and said, nope, we're going beyond that. And when they did that, they actually went to a point where there were no technologies available in the world to reduce the levels to those points. So they could not even run those coal-fired plants. So the EPA had a big handle that they could apply to anyone. We had issues with wetland identification. There were properties that, for some reason, they flooded either through a drainage canal that blocked or whatever. There was water that came up, and the water went back down, and it was on the side of a hill. They could still come in and declare wetlands. And it could be that you could get every geologist in the country to come out and say, well, no, this is not wetlands. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered is what they classified it as. And if you wanted to fight them, that was okay. You could appeal it all the way through the Environmental Protection Agency structure. But then at the end, that was it. You could not take it outside. And in a lot of agencies, if for some reason you don't get the answer you want or you think is right, you can appeal it to the federal court system. EPA didn't allow that until about 6, 7 years ago. There was a case that went before them. It was a situation where they had declared the property as wetlands, and the individual took it all the way up. And the argument the EPA was they were the final authority. Well, the federal court system changed that. Now you can appeal outside of the EPA. Now we've seen a reduction in the regulatory burden out of the EPA over the last period of time. It was actually a stimulus to get some of these businesses going. Well, we have the Govian taxes, corrective taxes and subsidies. They induce private decision makers to take into account the social costs that arise from the negative externality. So if the government applies that tax, it's going to affect your private decision making as a consumer. A lot of people quit smoking as the price of cigarettes continued to go up. Some it didn't matter, they just quit anyway because their understanding of the byproduct of smoking breaks number of years. It places a price on the right pollute. So if you look at some of the companies that they have cleaning processes where they use water, the water coming out of those facilities is not as clean as the water that went in. If it's in machining and other type businesses, it has heavy metals and other things that are contained within the water after it's used in the process. So if they have to pay for that, if they want to pollute, they will. If they think that they can do it without pollution, or they can find a new technology to eliminate that problem, they'll do so. They'll do a cost-benefit analysis, say, which one do we need to choose? We can reduce pollution at a lower cost to society. We can raise revenue for the government if it's done through corrective taxes, and enhance economic efficiency. That one I have a little shady on, but if you include the cost of the pollution, yeah, it's a little more efficient. Negative externalities associated with driving. We can, like I was talking about, reduce the dependence on oil, no blood for oil. When we look at the oil, let's see, I remember when it really went up. I think it was after Katrina. We started seeing a huge spike in oil prices. And the result was people didn't drive as much. Individuals that had SUVs wanted to get rid of them. Today, one of the most popular selling vehicles in the marketplace is a pickup truck or an SUV. During that time frame, dealers didn't even want to see a pickup truck or an SUV come in on trade because they couldn't do anything with it, because the price of oil went so high. Now, if we want to lower greenhouse emissions and all that, we can raise the price to the point it makes you, as a consumer, look at everything you're doing. Do I really need to go to the mountains or Florida? You'll find something closer. You'll look at public transportation. You will look at alternatives. Now, there's a perception of when that happened, there were a lot of positive externalities. There was discussion about you're reducing greenhouse gases. You're stopping global warming. But we don't have global warming anymore. It's called climate change. It kind of catches it either way it goes. But what they were looking at here, if you're driving, there's going to be more congestion, accidents, and pollution. If we can stop people from driving, we'll see the deaths, motor vehicle deaths, decline. The gas tax, corrective tax, doesn't cause deadweight losses, makes the economy work better, less congestion, safer roads, cleaner environment. You go into Europe and some of those smaller countries, everything's public transportation. And you go into some little communities, they have everything they need in the community. They don't go anywhere. They'll live and die in the same city or same geographical area. And that's by choice, but the government can put taxes on vehicles, the types of vehicles. They can ban certain vehicles, and they can also have tougher emission standards. You see that commercial with Amazon showing all the new trucks that they're going to battery-powered trucks. And the objective is to remove those externalities of burning carbon-based fuels, even LP gas. Problem is, you can say that those vehicles are zero emission, but they're not. Lead is a very toxic item using those batteries, and there's disposal costs with lead and reprocessing costs with lead and the acids they create. It's not difficult to to deactivate the acids. Baking soda and water will deactivate it. But even being electric, there are costs. Where do they get the energy from? You look at all the electrical cables and cords that have to be run to hold that power. Somebody's making those. Somebody's producing steel, the facilities to make the products, cars, and everything else. So it's not zero emissions just because it has a battery sitting in it. Now, there can be the perception that everything's greater, but you have to look at the big picture. You just can't look at, now they don't pull up to the gas pump, but they pull up to some type of facility to repower their vehicle. How high should the tax on gasoline be? In Europe, it's very high. You see more smaller vehicles. You see it in Japan. Smaller vehicles, more public transportation. Excuse me. In the U.S., we can't have that. Not to the degree they have it in Europe, for the simple reason. Look at the population density in North Carolina. There are several regions that are highly dense, and you have areas that, there's long distances to go. There's no public transportation. If you live in Johnson County and work in Raleigh, or you live in Catawba County and you work in Charlotte, you've got to drive. Carpooling is good, but you have to drive. So it's unlike what you see in Europe. You don't have any alternatives. Now, if you live in New York City and you work in New York City, you have no need for a car. You have the subway systems, and if you're above that, you can go to the taxis, and Uber and Lyft, and hire a limousine. There are other alternatives if you want to get around New York City. The cost of owning a car is very high. So it is a very much, even a small car is a luxury item. So in the Journal of Economic Literature, in 2005, the price was $2.28 per gallon. 2018, it was $2 a gallon. And the actual tax in the U.S. around 2018, that's an average tax, because I think in North Carolina it's higher than that per gallon. But the government gets 50 cents a gallon. They say it's for roads and bridges and maintenance, etc. So the government will collect that money. But if you look at the value, it's not something that everybody looks at. But in 2005, the price was $2.28 a gallon. We've actually seen a reduction in the cost of transportation. Now, we saw some periods between 2005 and 2018 where the prices went sky high and people started backing off their driving. But as it gets cheaper, we will take advantage of it. We'll drive more. We'll get bigger vehicles, either for safety or just we like the big vehicles. Either way. Now, the tax revenue from a gasoline tax is lower taxes at stored incentives and cause deadweight loss. So they could reduce the tax on groceries, food products. If there's a new industry coming about, we can do something to subsidize them to offset the taxes that they pay. And we could also, if we want to get industry in, we can give them a package deal where they won't pay property taxes for 10 years or 20 years. that they bring their industry into your county or city or state. Because you believe you're going to offset that with the people coming into town, they're going to drive vehicles, they're going to pay income taxes, etc., which is going to produce an economic boom just with the additional revenues coming into the marketplace. Some government regulations, production of fuel efficient cars is unnecessary. Eventually, we're going to find it. It's either going to be hydrogen power or something in that order. And we're going to find that process is going to make our environment better and us better as well. I think I saw where Tesla, I can't remember his name right now, but he came out and said there's going to be a $34,000 Tesla coming out. So when we look at that, the market's determining that. The market's saying we want a more fuel efficient vehicle, but we still want something that's reliable, safe, etc. Carbon taxes. If we have carbon taxes on carbon or exhaust from producing goods, it says the Brookings Institute recently described the U.S. carbon tax of $20 per ton, increasing at 4% a year, would raise an estimated $150 billion a year in federal revenues over the next decade. Given the negative externalities created by the carbon dioxide emissions, the federal carbon tax at this rate would involve fewer harmful net distortions to the U.S. economy than a tax increase that generated the same revenue by raising marginal tax rates on labor income across the board. Most economists would agree. If it's between raising marginal tax rates for labor and the carbon taxes are a better choice as far as seeing the impact across the board. Don't forget, this $20 per ton, it may raise $150 billion for the government, but if it's industry, you're paying for it. Now, the amount you pay for it is going to be based on the slope of the demand curve. But you will feel it, but not to the same degree as if they went in there and raised your payroll taxes. The tax on the carbon content of fuels would be a less expensive way to reduce carbon dioxide emissions than with a collection of policies such as corporate average fuel economy, etc. So if we just tell them you got to be at 50 miles a gallon by 2035, they're not going to be as motivated as they would if you told them we're going to put a carbon tax on your product, and for every mile per gallon your average is above X, you're going to pay a tax. I guarantee you the businesses, the car manufacturers will start looking at ways to reduce their tax liabilities. That's why they're in business. But we have to remember, when we look at the automobile industry, and we're talking about negative externalities, we have to include the entire process of producing the vehicle, all the way from the steel, the gathering the iron ore, the nickel, the copper, the bauxite, everything. The process of producing steel, producing aluminum, or processing copper and gold and so forth. We have to take that into account. We can't just look at the vehicle and say battery, no impact. Because of everything it took to place that vehicle there is going to be carbon emissions. Now we can have credible pollution permits. You see companies like Amazon showing they have commercials, and the whole purpose of the commercial is goodwill, to tell you that they're doing their best to be the best citizen neighbor. And one thing they're talking about is being able to go zero carbon footprint. Bezos alone owns millions upon millions of acres of land that he's purchased. There are a lot of these solar power stations that are being built. Some of them are being built through his funding. He uses it as an offset to the power that he requires to run their facilities. So they don't build a building and make it 100% energy efficient and off the grid. They can't do that. They have to be on the grid. They have to have that power coming in, but they offset it by, they say, if we use 100 kilowatts here, I'm going to build enough solar plant that average 100 kilowatts there for an offset. Now we can have tradable pollutions. Now with Amazon, if we go to tradable permits, they're going to have a bunch of them available, and they're going to be valuable. Because if you do produce carbon, and you don't have any way to produce your product without producing carbon, you're going to have to pay for those products just like you would the raw materials to produce your gun or your toy or whatever you may be producing. And one of the biggest owners of those tradable permits will be companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft. So if you think they were wealthy before, that's going to be a commodity that they're going to be able to trade and make even more money. Now, with scarce resources, we can have pollution permits, you have trade permits, and the willingness to pay will determine on the cost of reducing pollution. Okay. The advantage of a free market for pollution permits, the initial allocation of pollution permits doesn't matter. The firms can produce pollution at a low cost, they'll sell their permits. If the firms can reduce pollution only at a high cost, they're going to buy what they need to produce their product, as long as the consumer is willing to pay that price. And there will be efficient allocation. Then again, like I said, you're going to have companies like Microsoft, Google, and all those. They've got large numbers of alternative energy producing sites, be it wind generated, solar, geothermal. They're going to be the ones selling the permits. Reduce pollution using pollution permits or corrective taxes. One, the firm pays for the pollution, or the consumer pays it because that cost will be transferred to the consumer. The big thing is they'll be aware of the impact of producing it on the marketplace, either through having to pay a tax or purchase permits. And it says it internalizes the externality of the pollution. It will internalize it, but the cost is going to be transferred to some degree to consumer based on the slope of the demand curve or the elasticity of the curve. We see with the two different graphs, if we put a corrective tax in place, it's going to be, we're going to set that price right there. If we have pollution permits, the supply curve is going to be inelastic. They're going to pay it up to a point. and either they leave or they stay. Now, there's Elon Musk said we cannot give anyone the option of polluting for a fee. So what you would see if you have the tradable permits, we're allowing people to pay to put more pollution into our environment. And that was Elon Musk's biggest concern was, they're not being punished for it. They actually can pay and do whatever they want. We cannot eliminate all pollution. Never's going to happen. Now, if we don't have clean water, we don't have clean air, our standard of living will fall. If you look at some of the third world countries, one of the biggest issues they have is water. And clean and potable water is even a greater problem. That's when you see some of the diseases that are transferred through polluted water. It has a huge impact on life and the quality of living, or standard of living. Now, we expect a clean environment. It's a normal good to us. We expect it. Now, richer countries can afford it, and poorest cannot. We can have more rigorous environmental protection. But if we apply those rules to someone else, it's not going to work. Those countries are going to sit back and they're going to say, if you place those burdens on us, we're dead in our tracks. We can't do anything. That was some of the argument with the creation of NAFTA, and then when that was eliminated, Mexico, Canada, U.S. trade agreement, they still covered some of this. There's no expectation that Mexico meets all the standards that are now in place in the U.S. As their standard of living gets up, as their wages go up, as their technology advances, education expands, you will see them become more concerned with environmental practices. The lower the cost of or the price of environmental protection, the more public will want it. Now, if they perceive the price is low, they're going to want more. Sometimes that cost is hidden because it comes in their power bills, their water bills, the price for a car or other products. We have moral codes and social sanctions. We have charities, self-interest, and relevant parties. We're all part of the system, and together we'll find a solution. There's the Hall River project. They've been cleaning up the Hall River for 40 years, having those groups get together and pick up trash on the Hall River. And they agree, this is what we need to do as a group and as a citizen that appreciates clean water, clean air. Now, we can live in a homeowners association, and as a group, we don't want things to happen that are going to devalue our properties. We want things to happen that add value, like a new swimming pool or a golf course or other items. We can improve our standard of living. And as a group, we can look for those changes. The Coase theorem is very simple. If we eliminate the burden between individuals involved in the decision-making process, and everybody is aware of the true cost, they will find a solution on their own. Whatever the initial distribution of rights, interested parties will bargain together. Everyone will be better off, and the outcome is efficient. That's without the government. But both parties have to be knowledgeable about the externalities, both positive and negative. The example they give in the book, in this presentation, Emily has the legal right to keep a barking dog. As long as there's no animal restrictions or annoyance rules out, Emily can have the dog. And she gets a $500 benefit from the dog, psychologically, physically, or imagined. Horace bears an $800 cost from the barking. He can't sleep. It's annoying all day long. And there's a cost to him, in his belief, of $800. Now, for an efficient outcome, Horace can offer Emily $600 to get rid of the dog. And if she gladly accepts, we've resolved the problem. And both are better off. She received a benefit greater than what her existing benefit was, a difference of $100. And Horace, instead of the cost being $800, the cost is $600. And the dog is gone. But they're both aware of what their initial costs are. Now, she still has the legal right to keep a barking dog, but let's say she gets $1,000 benefit from the dog, or still has $800 cost. Emily's going to turn down any offer below $1,000, and Horace will not offer any amount above $800. So I guess Horace is going to have to decide how to deal with the barking dog, because Emily's going to keep it. Horace is not going to pay anything over $800 because this is base cost. Now, Horace can legally compel Emily to get rid of the dog if there's an ordinance or something in play. Emily can offer to pay Horace to allow him to keep the dog. If the benefit of the dog to Emily exceeds the cost of the barking to Horace, then Emily and Horace can strike a bargain which Emily keeps the dog. If we go back to where it was, her benefit was $1,000, his cost was $800. She can tell him, "I'll give you $800 if I can keep the dog." She still retains $1,000 in benefit. Now, the reason private solutions are not as great as the government and the business community. If we're negotiating with Chevy, we don't know their cost structure. They don't know ours, and it's not going to be an honest negotiation. I'm dealing with some insurance companies now on some damage to a piece of property. They're saying one number, I'm saying another. I hope we'll reach a point where we're both happy. I prefer to reach a point where I'm happier than they are. But there's always going to be cost incurred. But in private solutions, the transaction costs are very high. We're talking millions or billions, or in some businesses, $100,000, $10,000, or even $100 could be considered high transactional costs. It's based on the parties that are involved, or one of the parties involved. And if we just can't agree. Now with the dog, if they can't agree, Emily's not going to get rid of the dog, and regardless of what Horace does. And Horace is not going to pay somebody to get rid of a dog that's annoying. At that point, the cost, the negotiations to offset the externalities are gone. And the more people involved, so if it's the whole neighborhood that's against Emily, some people are going to receive more benefit than cost. And it may be that everybody wants $800 like Horace, or $900 like Horace, but they live a block away. They shouldn't be receiving the same benefit. But that's normally where arguments arise, at the individual's actual cost and benefit from the process. Now, a battery died on my pointer here, my mouse. Okay. Do we have any questions on externalities? Any examples of externalities? Now, if you go to the PowerPoint section where I have course documents, when you get to PowerPoint, the exhibits show you just the graphs. So you can look at the individual graphs, you can and visualize changes. If nothing else, when you take the test, have these available to you. Even this basic supply and demand curve. It may be nothing to deal with externalities. You may be dealing with taxes. You can use this base one to kind of get an idea of where everything's going to go. Mentally, you can just see the lines moving, or you can physically move the lines. Use a pencil, erase them when you're done, continue to the next question. But these would be nice to have available when you are testing, because you can see what's going on. And when they talk about what happens when you have a negative externality and it's applied directly to the supplier of the good, does the curve move to the left or the right or up or down? According to the book, it moves up. And that's because if it's $100, distance between this point and this point is going to be $100. Here and down here and anywhere along this curve. Now, this equilibrium doesn't move $100. If we look at the price points, but the cost goes up $100. And based on the slope of demand curve, we're going to see who's going to pay that cost. And if it's inelastic, we see here, some will pay it all, or they won't get anything. Okay? Questions? Comments?